Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Andrea Piero, and I'm the director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's lecture by visiting artist Pedro Reyes. We're so thrilled to have Pedro join us from his home and studio in Mexico City, and I would like to thank him for taking the time to share his important work with us this evening. This lecture is presented in conjunction with the course Imagining the Invisible, which is co-taught by SAIC professors Mary Jane Jacob and Alan Lab. The course is part of a year-long program of SAIC's Office of Community Engagement and the Institute for Curatorial Research and Practice, as well as the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists at University of Chicago, and is funded by the Abacanovich Arts and Culture Foundation. This program is also supported in part by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council Agency. The Visiting Artists Program is one of the oldest public programs at SAIC, and each academic year we host a variety of presentations by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars to expand our thinking about contemporary art and to share their expertise with all of us. In addition to public programs, our guests meet with SAIC students through a variety of engagements, and we look forward to welcoming Pedro tomorrow to meet with students enrolled in the Imagining the Invisible course, as well as students in our graduate program for a discussion. You may find more information about the Visiting Artists Program by visiting our website, and we'll drop the URL in the chat. I would like to invite you to join us again on March 16th at 6:30 p.m. when we welcome distinguished alum Meg Olney, who is Associate Curator at the Institute for Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. In just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Paul Coffey, SAIC's Vice Provost and Dean of Community Engagement, to introduce Pedro Reyes. Pedro will then speak for about 45 to 60 minutes, and then Paul will join Pedro on screen to facilitate a few questions from the audience before we conclude by 7:45. If you'd like to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many questions as time allows. So thank you again for joining us. And now I'd like to welcome Paul Coffey.
Thank you, Andrea. This is your Vice Provost and Dean of Community Engagement coming to you live from a basement in Park Ridge. You know, the start of these visiting artists lectures, it's too often said that it's my great honor, but I think there's no other way to say it than it's my great honor to introduce you to Pedro Reyes, the artist, the architect, the interdisciplinary thinker, our collaborator, and my friend. I'm not going to run through Pedro's impressive resume, and I'm not going to tell you about his work at Creative Times or his inclusion in the Venice Biennale or Documenta 13 or of his numerous exhibitions, including the Hammer, the Walker, the Guggenheim, Whitechapel, or the Gwangju Biennial in Korea. Those are only to name a few. I'm also not going to tell you about his Ford Fellowship or the fact that he's represented by Lisong Gallery. What I do want to talk about is this beautiful artist and scholar. Through his compassion for communities and his desire to collaborate with others, his ability to transform haunting material into objects of the sublime. I want to say that again. His ability to transform haunting objects into objects of the sublime. I first met Pedro when we were looking for a way to start our legacy project, Oaks of North Lawndale. We wanted to choose an artist to collaborate with who resonated with SAIC's core value, particularly the value of meaning and making are inseparable. We also wanted to choose an artist that articulated our commitment to the city of Chicago and North Lawndale in particular. We called Pedro out of the blue and we asked him if he'd be interested in restaging Palas por Pistolas. I was able to witness his compassion for community in the practice with the way that he engaged thoughtfully and respectfully with our partners in North Lawndale as we together made this work with Pedro. Not only did he agree to come to Chicago, but he also turned around and donated the addition of the shovels back to SAIC to sell to fund future plantings of the trees. 2 years later, Pedro returned, only this time with legendary cellist Yo-Yo Ma when he was touring Chicago. And Yo-Yo did a day of action where Yo-Yo and Pedro and community members from North Lawndale planted trees in Unity Park in North Lawndale. All that have worked with Pedro have been incredibly humbled by his generosity. Here, I want to get off the stage so Pedro can get on the stage, but I just want to finish by telling you a story that I hope illuminates another one of core value of SAIC, and that's that we are artists and scholars. When Pedro first came to Chicago, he was early for our meeting. And so he asked, well, could you direct me to the library? I said, sure, it's on the 6th floor. And so Pedro disappeared into the library and into the stacks. When our meetings were finished, we went down to the library to find him, only to see that he had surrounded himself with stacks and stacks of books, and he was feverishly going through, flipping through the pages. When he saw us approach, he got this childish grin, and he just looked up at me and said, Paul, you've got great books. So later on, as I was going through some images of Pedro, I saw this image of his library at home. And Pedro is going to tell you about that later. So again, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our community and reintroduce our community to Pedro Reyes.
Paul, thank you so much for those generous words. I'm very humbled to join everyone tonight. As Paul already mentioned, we have a relationship in this UNAGA where several projects that and invitations that the school has promoted, especially in North Lawndale, which are very, very special and very dear, because there are not so often like opportunities to put into practice all these ideas of social sculpture, and I believe that that it's beautiful when a school has this agency and this commitment to improve a community. So thank you so very much for that introduction. And tonight I may start telling or sharing with you some works that a lot of them deal with disarmament and pacifism and these ideas of social practice or social sculpture, which are one of the strengths of the school, and that and precisely to tie in with the course that Mary Jane Jacobs has been conducting. So maybe we could start by seeing the first slide. As Paul mentioned Palas por Pistolas, and I want to start by sharing sharing images of this piece in particular, because obviously there's like a genealogy, to works, and one that is kind of evident is Joseph Boy's 7,000 Oaks. But I think that beyond the object, when one does a project in the realm of the social, it's helpful to have an object, but that object is kind of living in an environment or a set of actions that engage with the community, So Palas por Pistola started in 2007 out of an invitation of a botanical garden in a city called Culiacan, west of Mexico, where a patron, a philanthropist, wanted to improve the city and invited me to do a piece. So what we organized was a campaign to collect weapons. And the idea was to put a call. So I'm gonna show you something that were like a number of TV spots that were produced back then. And this was a little bit based on a theory called modeling behavior by a Canadian sociologist called Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura was known for something called the Bobo doll experiment, where he had a kind of a inflatable doll, the ones that you punch, and he made a social experiment where he had like kind of a set of kids that were shown violent images of war, etc., and others that were shown like kind of a pleasant and friendly images, and the ones that were kind of exposed to the kind of aggressive material were then the kind of punching the doll and trying to kill the doll, or etc., and the others were hugging the doll, etc. So this was a kind of early in the development of behavioral psychology. The idea was to prove with this experiment where their images would influence behavior. So a little bit like following that thesis of modeling behavior, the idea of the TV spots were to kind of set family situations where we could like put in action the discussion at the interior of the family on giving up a weapon that, people had to take the gun and take it to the city hall and surrender that gun for those guns to be melted and made into shovels. But what we did was to kind of use a little bit like the model of a soap opera, and basically to kind of set the stage so they knew, for the citizens to convey the message that when surrendering a weapon, there would be no questions asked, and that because when you bring a gun and surrender a gun, people may have a certain distrust for the government, thinking that perhaps there's a story to that gun and that they don't want to be involved in any kind of accusation or etc. So part of the idea of these TV spots was to give certain reassurance to the population of Culiacan that they had nothing to fear by bringing those guns. So we can maybe watch that short video.
Le encontré a mi hijo una pistola escondida en su cuarto. Yo no quiero que mi hijo sea un asesino. Aquí vengo a donarla. Un arma en casa es un peligro. Dónala y colabora por un mejor Sinaloa. Del 26 de mayo al 8 de junio. Palacio Municipal. Sociedad y Gobierno unidos en la campaña de donación y registro voluntario de armas de fuego. Consejo Estatal de Seguridad Pública de Sinaloa. Y la Cámara de la Industria de la Radio y la Televisión. Delegación Sinaloa.
A mi marido no le va a gustar nada, pero ya me harté de que nomás se toma unos tragos y le da por sacar la pistola delante de nuestros hijos. Aquí vengo, señor, a donar esta arma.
Un arma en casa es un peligro. Dónala y colabora por un mejor Sinaloa. Del 26 de mayo.
So those were kind of some of the TV spots and the campaign was successful. We collected 1,527 guns. So the same number of guns that were collected were then destroyed in order to make shovels. And in order to keep that same arithmetic, we made the exact name of shovels with that gun, with that metal. which is a kind of a basic of a sculptural operation, like a sculptures transform matter. And the idea is that the physical transformation would go hand in hand with a psychological transformation and hopefully social transformation. So in that sense, the social transformation happens when something, like guns are kind of an agent of death that impact communities, and the idea of making the shovel was to have another kind of object that would do the opposite, not to create trust and to bring communities together. Maybe we can see the next video. Then, so here are some of the shovels being melted, or actually like kind of put red hot into a mold. And then maybe in the following images, we may see some of these shovels in action. Let's see, yeah, next. That's one of the tree plantings. And this is something that one of the kind of important discoveries during making this project was that obviously when people gather to do the plantings, it it was basically like an opportunity to discuss about the issue of gun violence, which is a problem that is common to both the United States and Mexico. And that several of these plantings have happened in the United States. I think that is often very interesting to see that how to call it, that you need the object in order as a catalyzer of the social process, no? So what happened after this project was that I was offered to do a similar project in the city of Ciudad Juárez, and then that's when I decided to do something else. Let's try to see the next slide, which is to make musical instruments. And the musical instruments was basically the idea of having like a role, a kind of the same role of the shovel, which is to create an event, no? Like when someone is playing music, everyone is connected by the same experience of sound, and that is something that will kind of feel the atmosphere, not like a concert is also some sort of a collective experience that I saw had the same potential as the tree plantings. Maybe we can see next images. In a little bit in that process, you know, I think that one sometimes have to proceed a little bit like a caveman, because, you know, like taking the metal and blowing or scratching or percussing these barrels or from shotguns, etc., will be like a way to produce sound. So this, for instance, like a sort of percussion instrument. We can see this next. This is like a sort of a psaltery, like a string instrument. Next. This is a violin. Next. These are flutes and a saxophone. Next. Next. Okay, that's that's one, for instance, one of the flutes in action. We can maybe, for instance, like this is how some of the flutes have been used. For instance, this was one of the chapters of this happened in Cincinnati with March for Our Lives, that you may be familiar with. The survivors of Parkland, Florida, that created like this, one of the most inspiring movements that came out of the US in the last few years, and where most of the actors were high school students. No, I think that is incredibly inspiring movement. And they had this banner that said, "We made holes in the guns before the guns made holes in us." Maybe you can see the next slide. So some of the development of these instruments continued. You know, not always you have kind of I mean, like a concert has a limited time span. So when faced with the situation of how to exhibit this in a museum, I came up with this mechanized version of this arm, which is the name of the project, which are kind of sculptures that produce music with a score that is controlled by an electronic brain, no? So the like a computer sends signals to these instruments and they perform. We can see the next slide. Some of these instruments kind of were, you know, like a kind of non-existent. So this one, for instance, is called the Kalishnikov, which is 12 chargers from an AK-47 that are organized and that are percussed by these mallets. Next one. Or this one, for instance, is kind of a little bit like a xylophone or a piano with 3 octaves. So it's you can play Mozart or Bach or any kind of score through the. And this is interesting because you know you cut these barrels at different lengths, so they will produce different sounds. Next. Next. And what I was mentioning about the companies, no? For instance, last year I made a new development of this project, which are these music boxes, where I was trying to point out, because also what I had experienced is that coming from Mexico, some of the interpretation of this work that was that you know like that I was coming from a violent country, that was like kind of the material that I had available or something like that. But in reality, I don't think that this project has a specificity that deals with Mexico, but I think that is a kind of universal problem. So I wanted to point out to the source or the origin of the problem, because you know, like many of these weapons are produced in countries that you don't associate with violence. No, for instance, like this is a music box that is only made with Glock barrels from Glock guns, and Glock is an Austrian brand. So what I did in this project, which is called Return to Sender, was to take a score from Mozart, which is an Austrian composer, and then to take, you know, like it's a piece of Mozart that you turn the knob and then you hear like in a music box. Maybe we can see the next one. This is, for instance, the same, but done with Beretta, which is an Italian company. So I use Vivaldi. Maybe we can see like a video if we go next. Yeah. Okay, next. Okay, we can go. Okay, let's stop there. So you saw that, for instance, that was like the previous one was a passage from Mozart's Fourth Symphony, and this is a passage from Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the autumn. And what I wanted to point out is that these companies, you know, they have great marketing and they have great reputation, but that doesn't. But that's a mirage, you know. Like for instance, like Beretta is a company that is nearly 500 years old, and it's interesting because this is the same period of colonization of the American continent, where you know, like this you know, and colonization and gun manufacturing have always been hand in hand. The reason why a handful of Europeans were able to control the American continent was just because they had control over steel and weapons. So the most tragic events in history have and continue to be a matter, you know, like guns are always hand in hand with injustice. And I think that and that this is something that need to still be unpacked, because, you know, obviously there's a constant fetishization in media and movies, etc., of guns, which have to do with, you know, like a toxic masculinity and with a series of unresolved issues of also white supremacy, etc. So there is I wanted to show that, you know, we tend to buy this kind of a rhetoric that is the drug dealers or the gangs who are the dangerous persons in possession of guns, but that actually the people that we should really shaming and exposing is the companies that produce these weapons, which may be in Austria or in Belgium or in Italy or in France, or, you know, like in countries that we don't necessarily associate as violent, but they are responsible for an endless number of deaths. So for me, it was important to change a little bit like the way we talk about guns. We can move to the next. Next. And another project that is connected with you know, like when working with a problem, is often you may have to tackle the issue from different angles. So one of the biggest problems is legislation, and every time that you want to do progress about gun control, you have the Second Amendment as one of the biggest obstacles. So I mean, like, happily now the NRA has filed for bankruptcy, etc. So, and actually there's been like a little progress in terms of gun control since Biden took office. But still it's like a big issue, no? Because it's a matter of again, like a constellation of ideas that need to be addressed. And instead of saying let's eliminate the Second Amendment, or let's like I'll keep it as it is, because it's, you know, sometimes there's this belief that the Constitution is something that was kind of written by God, almost like something that, but actually not. Like the fact that it's called an amendment is that there was like this constant idea of improvement that has to happen to the law. So Amendment to the Amendment is a workshop that uses a technique called legislative theater, which was developed by Augusto Boal, which is, you know, like an incredible resource for anyone trying to work on the field of social practice, because it's a very good way to organize a pool of people and the way that this workshop works is that, for instance, you have a room where they may be 200 guests, and if you had to kind of give the microphone to each of them, only a tiny fraction would participate. So as opposed to do that, the way that it works is that you break the group in small groups of 10, let's say, and each group were given the task to rewrite the Second Amendment. So they run a discussion, and then after those 20, 30 minutes, they have to put together a new version of the Second Amendment. So we can see the next video.
Well, we're not lawyers, so we can't say this in a very eloquent way, but basically want to take the first part out, that we don't need the right to have a militia. That's irrelevant anymore. And that it shouldn't be a complete right, but something with a lot more serious restrictions. And however you say that, like a lawyer, that's how we say it.
Being necessary to the right of personal safety and the security of the people's state, those in good health, without violent history, education of the firearm, and of sound mind shall not be denied the right of a lawfully manufactured firearm.
The right of individuals to keep and bear arms, again, getting rid of the whole militia thing. The right of individuals to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed unless the exercise of this right infringes on the freedom of others.
A well-regulated and informed populace standing together in support of security for a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms in limited capacity and registered account that shall not be infringed upon.
So we came up with a well-regulated military being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of people to keep and bear arms shall also be well-regulated.
So we were very similar to our neighboring group over here, and the fact that this was written so long ago, and so we should just update it. So we changed it to a well-regulated militia defined as the National Guard, being necessary to the security of a free state, should not be infringed. The right of individual citizens to keep and bear arms may be infringed for the security of the state and individual.
Our group has agreed that abolish the Second Amendment, guns only for hunting purposes and armed forces. Militaries have to turn in their guns after work. There is a need for background checks.
So as you can see here in this slide, the Second Amendment is only a few lines long, but every group came up with an iteration that had elements of value, and it can be as small as changing a comma to a full rewrite. But overall, you know, like it's this idea of a spectrum of options. It's not finding the right or the wrong, but the more ideas that are discussed, the more elements and better elements of improvement to legislation will be out there. And then you can have a second round where people vote for the one that they feel is best written, no? And the best ones could move up, and it's not like necessarily like, you know, there would be people that would be willing to have a more gun-friendly amendment if they wanted, no? Like a part of this kind of a democratic process would be that it allows also for the initiative to move in any direction, so it's kind of entirely free of dogma. But basically, the idea is to unstock or to kind of overcome the idea that law is something unmutable. No, this is kind of part of the concept of social sculpture is that social sculpture has to be able to change the shape of things. Okay, let's keep going. This video, it was a forge here in Chicago, in North Lawndale, where precisely these shovels were made as the initiative of the that Paul had to do the Oaks for North Lawndale project, which I was impressed that now has over 700 trees planted. So it's a kind of a, I'm very, I want to celebrate the success of a drive that Paul has had in this project. I think that is a very, very happy situation. And one of the beautiful things about this and working with kind of a local forge was the opportunity to also do the same process of making the shovels by hand, which gave all this variety of shapes because of the hammering of that you just saw in the video. And maybe we can see the tree planting that we did a couple of years ago. There's Yo-Yoma, who was touring and giving a concert in Millennium Park that came to North Lawndale to help and got his hands dirty in the planting of these trees. So that is a project that we will continue, and that is kind of a still long way to be completed, but is the beautiful thing about trees is that they do grow. So some of those trees that were planted 2 years ago now are taller, and that I feel, like a very fond of this initiative by the School of the Art Institute. Let's see the next one. What do we have after? Kind of give me nostalgia to suddenly see these kind of projects where there's so much people together. In particular, for instance, like this was another project called the People's United Nations, which was done on 3 occasions. The first one, the Queen's Museum. And basically the idea was to do a parallel conference where, when you have the United Nations or any kind of a big summit in politics, there is this idea of diplomacy where diplomats are appointed by a state and they represent their government. But also a very common fact all around the world is that most people may be in disagreement with their kind of current leader. So the idea was to somehow create a parallel organization or a kind of an encounter where people were not representing their governments but their country, just like their peoples. And here, Queens was a very good place to start this because it's an incredibly diverse place. Some people say it's the most diverse place in the world. And also the building where the Queen's Museum used to be the first venue for the League of Nations, or before the United Nations moved to Manhattan. That's where they were meeting. So it took kind of 6 months to appoint delegates for each country. But once there were 160 countries represented, we made a weekend, or actually it was 3 days of different activities. And I find that one of the key elements to do, especially when you have these kind of projects where people are volunteering, it has to be very fulfilling and very rewarding for the participants. But also I believe that there's an important element, which is role play. Given the role of representing your country was something that people took very seriously. And it was that sense of responsibility that, they were very committed to being the voice for their country. Obviously in a kind of a very internationalist kind of a spirit. And it was like a place where a lot of friendships were born. Just like a beautiful event to be in the same room with people. I mean, like, you are always surrounded by people by different countries if you live in big cities. I think that that's not something strange, but what is special is to precisely be in role, like the kind of idea of mutual appreciation or mutual respect, and actually dressing up, or either it's in business clothes or in kind of a traditional attire. It was part of this big encounter game. So there's a number of activities that were done. A lot of when doing social practice is curious, because where like you to your main material is human relationships. So it's not that you may necessarily find those tools to transform human relationships in the history of art. Like, artists often work alone, and they're not necessarily like a resource for those kind of skills. So I think that a lot of tools for social practice may be found in conflict resolution, in theater, in therapy, in social psychology. I may show a couple of activities. We can maybe move to the next video.
If you can give your countries' names and one of your headlines or tweets, please.
Helena from Ethiopia, but I'm representing Somalia.
Claire from Rwanda.
Can we make a stop so I explain something?
Simone from Azerbaijan.
Okay, sorry. I may have to explain what this activity is. So in this activity, what people are requested is that everyone has to share what are their most embarrassed or ashamed about their country, which is a kind of a tough exercise. No, you have to confess what is it that you are not proud, but the opposite. Not like, and then together with your group, what you do is that you imagine that you wake up one day in an ideal world, and you open the newspaper and you read a news headline where that thing that you were most embarrassed by has been fixed. So crafting that headline is what the workshop is about. And precisely here, the psychodynamics is about, like, how do we move from complaint to proposal, no? From focusing on the problem to thinking on a potential solution, and how this solution can be short enough that it feels a headline, no? So it's just like a one-liner. So again, a little bit like the method of theater of the oppressed, or legislative theater, where people work in groups and they have this sharing at the end where they pass the microphone and they have like a way to deliver their results very fast. Is a little bit like what we're seeing today. We can continue watching the video now.
If you can give your country's names and one of your headlines or tweets, please.
Helena from Ethiopia, but I'm representing Somalia.
Claire from Rwanda.
Sasha from Montenegro. Simon from Azerbaijan.
Paulo from the Philippines. So we all collectively agreed on the following headline. The Philippine government announces joint initiative with the Catholic Church to open free birth control centers and abortion clinics nationwide.
That is radical and revolutionary thinking. Thank you.
I am Annette from Barbados. Nadine from the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Carolina, Costa Rica. And our headline says, no forced entry. And that is dealing with the subject of rape. And we're going to have a day where everyone around the world is going to wear a vagina badge. And it's going to say, no forced entry. So there, we are going to deal with rape.
For the current situation in Syria. The first is, filmmakers flock to Damascus to shoot historic war movies. So I guess it wasn't that tasteful.
We actually have a headline from the future, year 2130. November 23rd, 2130, remembering our nation's separation between the North and South Korea, celebrating our union of 50 years anniversary.
And then we have one from Turkey. The problem in Turkey, of course, is right now has the highest number of journalists in prison, and so the idea was to make prison a kind of journalistic mecca and develop journalism within prison. So the headline is Turkish Prison Times Sweeps the Pulitzers.
In Sri Lanka, the big issue is freedom of the press. It's very similar to Turkey. But in our country, they don't get to stay in prison, they go elsewhere. So our headline is, choose a career in Sri Lankan journalism, extended government-sponsored trips abroad.
We can come up with the alternative of the Olympics called the Paralympics. Basically, corruption Olympics. And discipline. And people will be competing in Forgive-a-thon, Bribe-a-thon, Hackathon, and boundary boxing.
Now, what would you like this person to know or do about what it is you're concerned about?
Well, he doesn't know that Venezuela was visited by Fidel Castro in 1959.
Now, wait, excuse me. Have you already discovered that in talking with him?
Did you know that Fidel Castro went to Venezuela in 1959 and gave a lecture?
No, I didn't know. You are correct, okay.
Nobody knows this.
Is there anything else that you think would be good to have put on the table?
Venezuela was the second country after Cuba to have guerrillas.
Yes. Okay.
Did you know that?
Okay.
In the 60s?
Okay. But my question is, we want to get something out of this that's useful for both of you after the discussion of the problems.
Okay, I was trying to discern a lineage that came from the visit of Castro, then the guerrillas, then the emergence of a neo-avant-garde group called El Techo de la Ballena, then necrophilia as a template to understand history.
And if see, the problem that I'm trying to have us step over is getting caught in the trap of always recycling what went wrong, what's going wrong, what keeps it going wrong, and the anger and the pain that keeps us tied into it. I'm trying to see is there some way beyond the reciting the truth of these
No,
terrible
there is no
things.
anger and pain. I'm trying to understand anthropologically where are the roots of this occupation between Cuba and Venezuela and vice versa.
And if you did,
I'm trying
then,
to discern that.
and if you did, is there something that might happen? If you did understand it completely and you
It might
understood
help,
the
you
roots,
know, to resolve the situation.
what would help look like?
In politics, there is no conclusion. In
Okay.
politics, there is discernment.
Okay. And
But maybe he has something to say about it.
well, that's a good point right there.
Do you have something to
Could
say
you
about it?
contribute to the conversation from
Yeah.
your point of view?
So I mean, to go back to what you were saying about building on a lineage, in Cuba, it goes back to things like the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 that said the Western Hemisphere is under U.S. control, and then that was backed up by the Roosevelt Corollary, which said, yeah, and if anyone tries to intervene, and if some countries don't know how to govern themselves, according to Teddy Roosevelt's language, we will step in and essentially teach them how to govern themselves. So lots of the roots are about American paternalism and American hegemony in the region. So that's, if you look at 1959 as a cause of Venezuelan problems, that's kind of letting the United States off of the hook, because the Cuban Revolution was a result of U.S. imperialism over the island and ultimately over the hemisphere. There was the hemisphere that
Time out.
Yeah.
Do you know what he's talking about?
Yeah, but I disagree with that.
I understand.
Okay, we got, we
The
may
reason
not
I've
have
interrupted
time
you
to
is
see
because
this
I
through
think
the
we
end.
deserve to have
But
some
what
way
you see
to
here
give-
in action is like this couples therapist that is basically taking delegates from two different countries and applying the same tools that he uses for for couples therapy, but to geopolitics. No, so it's guys, some of those kind of what I was trying to mention about like tools from theater, tools from psychology, applied through art to social problems, is kind of one of those areas of work that these big encounter games bring opportunity. We have like probably like 10 minutes left, so let's see how far we go. So maybe we watch a little bit of this video and we wrap up to be able to do some Q&A. So this was a project from 2020, which was, I think that it was mentioned at the beginning, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, through Pedro Alonso, who's a friend and curator, invited me to do a project basically because it has kind of fallen out of attention that we live under that one of our most pressing threats, even more pressing than world climate change, is the risk of a nuclear conflict, which can happen any minute, because not only because the unstable political relationships between countries, but only by the fact that there are 13,000 nuclear warheads, and that some of them are kind of old, etc. So if you remember the event that happened in Beirut last year with that massive explosion, and like that wasn't a nuclear thing, but it was an accident. So any moment we could have an accident of one of these nuclear missiles going off. There's so many examples in history where we've been very close to a false alarm of having a nuclear conflict, and that would activate this launching of nuclear bombs that would technically eliminate all life on Earth in a matter of hours. So here in the video, for instance, you see Rachel Bronson, who's the CEO or chief of the bulletin, that basically is a kind of organization that measures the risk of nuclear conflict. And last year we celebrated with this installation and this performance the signature of the Tlatelolco Treaty, which was a treaty that was signed in 1967 in the Tlatelolco Square. The Tlatelolco Square is known because in 68 there was like a student massacre that, like the students that were protesting were kind of shot by the military. But the year before, it was the scenario for the signature of this treaty. So I was interested, there's been a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows and books, etc., made about the students' protest, but kind of it is a kind of forgotten event that 1 year before that had happened, this was kind of a place where there was like the first time that all countries from Latin America and the Caribbean gathered together to sign this treaty. And what you see here in the event is the ambassadors from 36 countries that are part of the Tlatelolco Treaty with their flags, etc., because this was the first time that a nuclear ban was set in action. And this led to then the Rarotonga Treaty, which prohibited nuclear tests in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and then another treaties have emerged. Most recently, the one that ICANN, the International Campaign for to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, is trying to put. But in a way, the people who remember like growing up under the fear of nuclear conflict are boomers or Generation X, and millennials or Generation Z don't consider nuclear war a real threat. So we were thinking how to kind of start to bring back the anti-nuclear activism. And what we did was to do this performance with a dance company called Snowboards, and also the outfits that they're wearing were designed by Carla Fernandez, who's my wife and also an incredibly talented designer. So we kind of took some slogans that were used in the 70s and 80s, which was the height of anti-nuclear activism. And we had a band of doom, which was kind of the appropriate kind of a music for this context. And there was this kind of a choreography that was set in action. And then there's been a kind of a number of other activations that we have done regarding nuclear. I mean, like the idea of nuclear war is something that, in a way, there's still like a number of ideas that it is important to articulate, and that it is a kind of a work in progress that still will kind of continue part of the disarmament process. That like whatever we can do to bring attention to this issue, I believe that is very important, because we have this incredible risk, which is measured by the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock is a metaphor of how close we are to nuclear war. And last year, in 2020, it was announced that we were 100 seconds to midnight. And it's the closest that we ever been. And there's several reasons for this. One is that there's new nuclear investment. For instance, like the United States has granted contracts for nuclear modernization for $1.3 trillion. That's $1.3 trillion. It's a number that is even difficult for us to imagine. But what is happening with this money? What we're doing is that now there's nuclear bombs that are the size of a latte coffee, like this size. There are nuclear bombs that you can keep in a backpack that can be sent by a drone or set up in a car, etc. So the problem is that the modernization of nuclear weapons now has made the temptation to use them much bigger, and that is a problem, because if someone falls into the temptation of using this bomb, that will kind of activate all the other in automatized responses. No, that also a hack happening through the fact that it's curious, because 2 years ago the nuclear codes were still in a floppy disk. Last year they were passed to the cloud. But I don't think that we should feel safer now, that because now that they are in the cloud, there's kind of a more chances to do a breach of cybersecurity. So that's why the risk, even if we think of this as an issue of the past, the risk for nuclear war is closer than ever, and this is something that nobody's really paying attention. I don't know. I mean, if you go to the Instagram account of ICANN, you may find that they have 10,000 followers. It's not that they have a massive following, and this is the campaign that is most active out there. No, so I think that for instance, it's very inspiring that actually we have in the school that there's been discussion about this issue, and that this is something that we should take really seriously. As I don't feel that is something that that will ever be enough activism, because it's also it's not like climate change that you can do things by changing your behavior, and that they will have an impact. To bring nuclear disarmament, there has to be a kind of a big mobilization, because we have done this in the past, like in the 80s, when Reagan and Gorbachev sat in the table to do disarmament talks. The number of warheads came down from 90,000 to 13,000. So there's been moments in the past where this has been done, but this was done thanks to a lot of activism and also a lot of art. Because if you listen to music in the 80s, there were all these songs, pop songs, that were talking about nuclear war, and then there were a lot of movies that were made about nuclear conflict, etc. So culture has played a role in disarmament, and this is an issue that, in a way, sometimes it feels a little bit abandoned, because it's not like a problem that affects one specific demographic. It affects everyone, not only humans, like all life on Earth. But it's not something that is like, okay, well, it's a gender issue or like a race issue. This is precisely perhaps the fact that everybody is connected by this issue, maybe the reason why nobody kind of takes much ownership of it. So I think that this is kind of opportunity to revisit this issue and to try to work towards this direction. And I think that now we may be, kind of maybe I'll stop here because we have more slides, but I don't want to. I think that there's like a number of questions that would be worth trying to answer. So maybe we can start with Q&A.
Pedro, thank you. That was fantastic. We have our first question, and it actually is a question from my friend Molly in Richmond, Virginia. And she asked, can you talk more about how you persuade people to surrender their guns? And then a couple follow-up questions. Were they inspired by the good that would come from your transformation? And how did you help them see the value of being without their guns?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, in the TV spots, perhaps we had this kind of audio issue at the beginning. So, but actually, it doesn't matter because they were in Spanish. But the idea, for instance, like you had like a kind of a family situation where, for instance, some were trying to appeal to the issue of accidents. For instance, like in one of these soap opera situations, one kid finds a gun in the drawer of their parents and playing shoots his little friend, right?
Right.
So that's a very common accident. Actually, like it's a number one cause of death among kids in the United States. I don't know about the statistics in other countries, but it's a number like above car accidents and cancer, etc. It's a number one cause of death. So, for instance, like another one was like I found a gun in my son's closet. I don't want my son to be a criminal. So this was kind of ideas of trying to trigger the conversation in the core of the family to see their self-interest for their safety. Also, another one is the help of incentives, where with the sponsorship of Coppel, which is this electric appliances store, we were giving away, you would bring a gun and you could choose a microwave or a laptop or some things like that.
Right. So she followed up with a final kind of question about, could you talk about how joy plays into your artwork? A sense
yeah. Well, I think that joy is something that is like when you have moments of like kind of a little moments of utopia, you have a kind of a instinct of joy, but also I think that perhaps we resort on a number of there's like activism sometimes may be connected with also anger is very important or outrage, no? Yeah. But I think that sometimes we're always relying on finding who to blame, and that also has certain limitations. So when we're not trying to find who's guilty, but I have done that sometimes, when I'm pointing to the gun manufacturers, I'm saying, hey, these are the people who are guilty. No? But I think that in general, when you're trying to inspire kind of some to show up like the agency of people, just like also having a group activity where people have an excuse to gather and to be participant of something, joy will inevitably happen. But I think that it also is very important that this kind of a simple message helps, no?
Yeah, I think the audience is picking up on a lot of the the way the work works, moves in 2 or 3 directions. So this next question kind of anticipates that. Your work always takes on difficult topics surrounding misuse of power, but then flips it and turns it into humor, giving energy to heavy topics. Can you talk about your strategies for using humor and optimism in your work?
Yes. Well, I think that humor often, if you dissect a joke, you have setup and punchline, no? And oftentimes the punchline is extreme disappointment. So something is in the setup, like something is going in the wrong direction, and then you have extreme disappointment, and then laughter is your coping mechanism. So it's like an airbag that cautions your impact with your expectations of reality, and laughter is that like kind of that cushion. But what I'm interested is in pursuing a sort of upward drop where you present an extremely optimist outcome that is so optimist, so the utopian, that is kind of laughable, no? But if there's what the point here is exaggeration. You know, like what you need to capture the collective imagination is to exaggerate things. So you can exaggerate things also by dreaming of a kind of an extremely optimist thing, and then there's that's a kind of a, it maybe doesn't work so well as humor always, but is I think that that dreaming widely can be one or way to go.
You know, our president, Alyssa Tenney, has us institutionally focused on the responsibilities of citizen artists. And so this question is kind of anticipating that. And I think it's grounded in all the work that you do around the UN and your international career. So the question is, what are the most important things you've learned surrounding citizenship in your practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's these rules of I mean, like artists, the people think that they break rules, but in reality, what artists do is to add the rules. You know, like when you have a kind of a participation, you set like a number of rules, and then people who participate with you in this activity or game are like take up the challenge of following those rules, no? Rewriting the Second Amendment, or finding a headline or something like that. So what is interesting is that the artist doesn't have to be the one bringing up the solutions. What you have to be is setting up the rules of the solution has to check these boxes, right? And then the creativity of the collective will be a living proof of how resourceful people are, and the variety of alternatives. So, and this is precisely one of the teachings of Boal, no? That, you know, like with forum theater, etc. What seemed an untractable or a situation actually has many different outcomes. But, you know, also you have to be clear, you know, it doesn't mean that, you know, things can be solved by magic, you know. It has to be something that is plausible.
Right.
You know? Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be our last question. I wanted to talk maybe about the pragmatics of making the work. And it's a real particular one about, are there grants for from the Mexican government that help fund the work with guns? What is the response of the Mexican government to this work?
Well, actually, for making balas por pistolas, I had I had to work through the government, because the military are the only people who can manipulate the destroyed weapons. So, for instance, we organized a campaign, but once the guns were kind of collected, actually it was the when you were 17 or 18, you have to do military service, no?
Yeah.
So, for instance, there was a lot of there were these youth in the state of Sinaloa that they had to take out of the gun all the parts that were not metal, like the wood, the plastic, etc. And also they had to separate aluminum from steel, because you cannot melt them together.
Right.
So it was like youth that was doing the military service that helped break down the metal, and also these safety issues, not so you don't want the kids to be fooling around with guns. So they were instructed by the military, which are specialists on this. And actually, it's curious, because at that project, kind of I had work with actually it's been so long that I have worked with 3 different administrations, and I sometimes have criticisms of working with the military, because I started working on with this before Ayotzinapa, which was this killing of students that was conducted by or that military were involved in this maybe 10 years ago, no less. But I started working before this had happened. Yeah. And probably if I started working after, I wouldn't, the military had a kind of a good reputation relatively before this, but then some people were kind of very critical of me, and saying how are you, if you're collaborating with the military, you're endorsing this other action that has happened, no? And I had to explain myself, because I cannot do this work without at some point working through the authorities. It's illegal to start with, no? So what is important is also to acknowledge that we tend to put all government as kind of under the same box, as if it were an actually kind of a consistent and coordinated entity. But government is composed of hundreds of agencies, many of, most of them full of well-intended people that try to do help their work as a public servant. And then, the fact that there's a corrupt politician here and a kind of other people that abuse power over there, doesn't mean that you suddenly have to reject government in its entirety. I think that that's kind of childish, to discriminate the work of hundreds of thousands of people together, no? And I'm an anarchist at heart and a socialist, and I think that but also we cannot live without these institutions, and there's a lot of people that are also trying to serve others. So I think that is kind of that we have to have certain of openness regarding to move agency, you know, because when you place yourself outside the institution, you project your interpretation of why the institution doesn't work. But once you start talking with the people inside the institution, it was one of the, if you want to produce change, you have to be the problem, you know, like, because only if you are the problem, you know, like, okay, what, like, let's think as if I am the institution. What the change will only happen inside the institution. So how can the institution improve? And then you have to position yourself inside it, no, to produce transformation.
And I'm hanging on those words right now because we're talking about so much of this ourselves. You know, I find myself constantly in a position of thanking you. So here I am again. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Thank you for taking us through your work. Thank you for putting this work out in the world. Thank you for being an inspiration to my office, to me, to the school. We so appreciate you, Pedro.
Thank you so much for your incredible, generous words, Paul, and thank you for all the students that have joined us tonight. I wish we had more time to continue talking, but I also know that we have reached the end of our time.
Till next time.
Yes.
Yes.
Much love.
Yep. Right back at you. Thank you.
Thank you.